Hello and welcome to episode 8 of the Geopolitical Review, where I sit down with leading academics and scholars to discuss and explore the forces shaping the world today. This project is in collaboration with the Democratic Security Institute, an international non-partisan think tank focused on exploring issues of democracy, security, peace building, and conflict resolution. By bringing together experts from around the world, the Institute provides a platform to discuss some of the most pressing geopolitical challenges of our time. In recent years, Georgia has found itself at the center of an increasingly uncertain geopolitical landscape. Long regarded as one of the European Union's most committed partners in the South Caucasus, the country is now grappling with growing domestic political tensions, renewed Russian pressure, and an international order that is becoming increasingly more fragmented and unstable. As great power competition returns and traditional security assumptions are challenged, Georgia faces a fundamental strategic question. Can it continue pursuing European integration while maintaining regional stability and protect its own sovereignty? At the same time, the 2024 election of the Georgian Dream Party has brought with it increasing questions regarding government legitimacy, human rights, and corruption. However, Georgia's location at the strategic crossroads between Central Asia and Europe presents significant opportunities. Could it become a regional hub for diplomacy, trade, and connectivity? Or does political polarization risk leaving it on the sidelines of the South Caucasus as it undergoes rapid transformation? To explore these questions, I'm joined by Medea Turashvili. Medea has around 20 years of research, analytical, and advocacy experience in various local and international organizations, including the International Crisis Group, the European Centre for Minority Issues, and Georgia's Ombuds Institution. She is the 2021 EDSN Fellow hosted by the Democratic Security Institute, and her research focuses on conflict, human rights, forced migration, democracy, and social transformation in the South Caucasus. I hope you enjoy the conversation. Hi, Medea. Nice to see you. Thank you for joining me this morning. I wanted to just ask if you could give a brief introduction as to who you are, what area you specialize in, and how you got to specialize in that area.
Hi, Grace. Thanks a lot for this opportunity. So my name is Medea Turashvili. I am Tbilisi-based analyst and peace practitioner, I would say so. I've been working in the field of peace building, human rights, human security, democracy building for around 20 years. And the reason I ended up in this field is also kind of quite natural and logical. I think I was 5 years old when the Soviet Union collapsed, and we were a family of 6, and basically. My family had to start the whole life from the scratch because we lost quite a lot of what we had before, and then the country was in chaos, in civil wars, in economic collapse, in social disruptions, in wars, a lot of internally displaced people, a lot of migrants, internal migrants. And so there was a lot of chaos happening. And, even at the very young age, I could see how disempowered, dispositioned people became. And, somehow I always had this, how to say, probably protest against this. People do not deserve to live in this kind of conditions. And somehow this experience led me to the field of political science, the field of human rights, and conflict studies. So I studied those fields, and then since then I've been working on peace building initiatives, on the researches, working with the Human Rights Commissioner in Georgia on human rights of conflict affected population, and somehow, trying to contribute to the progress, democracy, security, and human rights protection in this country, in Georgia.
So you obviously mentioned that Georgia used to be part of the Soviet Union, and since the collapse, you've seen Georgia try and balance its kind of EU NATO aspirations with its proximity to Russia. And in recent years, we've seen, the war in Ukraine, changes in like Western engagement with Georgia, especially like under the Donald Trump administration, and this evolving Russian influence. And that's raised questions for Georgia about the sustainability of this EU Western strategy. How would you characterize Georgia's strategic position today, compared with maybe 5 or 10 years ago? And what developments do you think have weakened these two pillars, as you put it in your recent article, of its foreign policy?
Yeah, thank you. I think that at the moment, Georgia really faces a very acute dilemma in a way, because international and regional systems are reshaping and changing. And for Georgia, as a small country, this is a big challenge, obviously, because we have a lot of, we have this growing divergence in the transatlantic partnerships. We have the great power politics coming back, and quite a lot of, conventional assumptions about post-Cold War security is also changing. So for Georgia, this is really, for Georgia, which for decades was, pro-Western country, the current situation is really unpredictable and puts the country into a very precarious position. And obviously, on the background, you have the war of aggression, Russian war of aggression against Ukraine, something that Georgia has already experienced itself. And Georgia considers Russia obviously to be existential threat to its sovereignty. Russia continues to occupy territories of Georgia and meddle in the internal politics and domestic politics as well. So this regional and international context is becoming more and more difficult. But at the same time, we have the internal political developments that have undermined Georgia's ability and readiness to navigate this shifting regional and global dynamics, right? So after 2024 controversial elections, Georgian Dream Party damaged its relationships with its partners, with the strategic partners. And, this has actually led to the isolation of Georgia from its partners. And I think this is really damaging for Georgia's peace and security and democratization agenda. So that's a little bit of the background at the moment that we are operating in, and navigating this period would be difficult in any situation, but now it's particularly difficult because of the ruling party's unwillingness to do compromises on the domestic level and to build a cohesion, societal cohesion, to build a political kind of power around itself. And this is obviously damaging the country in general. Now what we see the Georgian Dream Party doing is, I would argue, they prefer their own political interest, their own party interest, their own power interests over Georgia's national security interests. So I find this to be quite damaging for Georgia.
I know you've just touched on this, but obviously we've seen recently and in recent years, like civic unrest and protests in the street against Georgian Dream, this growing public opposition to its European isolation. And as you mentioned, some people argue that the government are doing it deliberately for their own interests. How I suppose, do you think that's weakened its international position in terms of drawing itself away from Europe and into the Russian sphere of influence? How is that relationship working in terms of the political elites and relationships between political elites, I suppose?
Yeah. So I do think that domestic politics is affecting how Georgian government at the moment is positioning itself externally as well, right? Well, first of all, we have to say that although they appear to have a grip on power, still I think they are on a shaky ground. And the polls show that there is a significant distrust and public disapproval of the current political party, public institutions. Public trust in the government, we can say, has collapsed and it stands at 18%. And obviously this leads to the question of legitimacy, right? So the current ruling party, I think, knows and understands that they do not have a political legitimacy among the Georgian citizens. So this is in a way puts them on a shaky ground and of course, affect some of the decisions they are making. But in addition, political polarization, authoritarian legislation, the contested legitimacy as well has weakened the institutional capacities as well, eroded the social trust in the institutions, eroded the social cohesion in general, and it undermines the ruling party's credibility both internally and internationally as well. And I think that obviously for any foreign policy initiatives, for any foreign and international relationships, you need credibility as a party, as an actor, right? You have to be a credible government actor. And I think that's why internal domestic legitimacy has also affected international legitimacy of the Georgian government. So that is a reason why we clearly see the link between the domestic affairs and international affairs, or the foreign policy performance of the government, which is not very credible internationally because it lacks internal legitimacy.
Okay, so I wanted to ask as well, obviously there's many facets to this question and there's quite a few answers on why Russia poses an existential threat to Georgia. And particularly in your recent article, you talk about kind of the weaponization of economic interdependence and how that relationship has progressed. And I suppose how concerned policymakers are and how concerned they should be about economic dependence on Russia.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, the Georgian narrative in general, the popular narrative believes that Russia wants to undermine Georgia's sovereignty, democracy, and to make Georgia dependent on Russia's whims, basically, and Kremlin's whims, right? So this is a very popular narrative, and we also see very specific instruments that Kremlin possesses when it comes to leveraging over domestic policies of Georgia or foreign policy choices as well. But when we say and when we talk about the weaponization of economic instruments in the hands of Russia, this is something that Georgia has experienced it's not like something we have seen in other countries, but something that we have experienced ourselves. So every time Georgia-Russia political relationships would deteriorate, Russia would use economic instruments against Georgia. And it started back in I can bring few examples from 2025, for instance, when Russia stopped the natural gas supply to Georgia in winter when Georgians largely depended on heating, depending on gas for heating. In 2006, Russia embargoed Georgian wine and mineral waters, and that accounted 80% of sales of Georgian wine and mineral waters. So, and that embargo came when there was a political tensions flaring up between Georgia and Russia. Later in 2019, Georgians went out to the streets to protest a Russian parliamentary delegation visiting Georgia and occupying the places in the Georgian parliament. This really triggered the society, and it was very emotional outburst, and people flooded the streets against this. The response from Russia was that they suspended flights to Georgia. So you understand that, anytime and every time there is going to be a political tension, political disagreement with Russia, Russia is going to use the economic instruments in its sense. And, they openly talk about that. They openly say, well, currently we have very good relationships with Georgia. That's their argument. Our economic ties are really very good. Russian tourists are feeding the Georgian economy, etc., etc. And this is true, actually. This is really happening. I mean, particularly past several years, Georgia's economy and dependence on Russian economy has been increasing. So we see that this can be really dangerous. We know that this can definitely undermine Georgia's economic sovereignty, right? And we know that this is a political instrument in the hands of Russia. So that's why, when we are talking about conflicts and peace and security in Georgia, we not only mean security threats coming from the hard security like tanks or bombs, but we also talk about those threats that are coming with economic instruments, with soft power instruments, where Russia really tries to undermine Georgia's sovereignty and independence and foreign policy choices.
So I suppose the question is, why are the ruling party in Georgia allowing that relationship to deepen and allowing those economic ties to deepen? Is it an allyship between the ruling party in Georgia and the Kremlin because they don't have that domestic legitimacy inside the country? Or is it appeasement, that they think that if they don't continue to deepen that relationship, they risk that hard power retaliation from Russia? Why are they allowing that relationship to deepen?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question, and $1 million question. But I would argue two things probably. Well, first of all, with the war in Ukraine, things are really unpredictable for Georgia, and there is very accurate, I would say, assumption that whatever the outcome of the war, things can still be very bad for Georgia. Even if Russia is losing in Ukraine, Russia still might need a success story, and that can be Georgia. That can be like a small neighboring country, right? So even like a favorable outcome on the Ukrainian front can be detrimental for Georgia. So maintaining some kind of predictability and balance, I think, is important. But there are things that Georgian Dream is also guided in this process, and it is not only the security of Georgia, but this is also their own economic benefits. The economic benefits for the people, those political elites who have economic interest in the economic relationships with Russia. And we know that, and there are statistics and there are researches which show that, those who do the trade with Russia, those who do, different types of economic activities in Russia, those who benefit from those economic activities from Russia are closely linked with the Georgian Dream political elites, with the family of the Georgian oligarch Bidzina Ivanishvili and the closed circle, basically. So there is this very clear interest of getting the economic benefit from the situation, particularly while the war is still going on in Ukraine, right? So kind of the war created economic opportunities for those political elites. And the third reason is, staying in power. And, obviously economic interest will be guaranteed by staying in the political power. And so the Georgian Dream understands very well that, democratic transformation, rule of law, protection of human rights, and all of those requirements that Georgia is required to fulfill on the way to the European integration will actually be detrimental to their power, to their grip on power, because it would require more pluralism, it will require rule of law, it will require public participation, political participation, etc. So for them, that is becoming a threat to their power. So in that sense, they are ready to forego Georgia's international position, Georgia's European future, and Georgia's integration into the European Union for the sake of their political and economic interests. And that suits very well to Russia's interests as well. And, whether or not they are appeasing, whether or not they have good friendship, whether or not, whatever we can call that, what we see at the moment is that Russian, Kremlin and, Georgian Dream's political interests are aligning, but this is going against Georgia's national interests.
Yeah, so it's at the expense of what the public want, because there is widespread public support for EU membership and EU integration. But in that lane, then, how would European integration, what implications would that have for Georgia and for, I suppose, conflict resolution and this closer alignment with Europe? What ramifications would that have for Georgia's relationship with, say, Abkhazia and South Ossetia, which are obviously still remain fairly friendly with Russia as well?
Of course, the situation with Abkhazia and South Ossetia is very complicated, and there is no easy solution. There is no one solution to those questions. However, I do believe that European integration of Georgia was something that would bring more peaceful perspectives to this country, and maybe not necessarily final solution of those conflicts, but I argue that this integration process, the EU integration process itself, and then eventual membership would be really useful for the conflict resolution for Georgia, for the peace and security in Georgia. Well, firstly, because with the EU integration process, Georgia would be building a different type of a country with which would provide guarantees of peace and security to Abkhazians and Ossetians. Georgia would be a country which would be totally different from what they have at the moment, which is a Russian model of governance in their territories. Georgia would offer more democratic, open governance model where minorities are protected and where the rights and self-determination of minorities are guaranteed, right? And that would be protected and guaranteed not only by the Georgian legislation, but by the European architecture, so to speak, right? So this would be something more appealing to Abkhazians and South Ossetians. So it's a lot about, what kind of alternative you are offering to Abkhazians and South Ossetians as opposed to the Russian model. And then a second issue is also the current context that Abkhazians particularly, and now Ossetians as well, with the recent developments in South Ossetia, we see that there is a clear risk of annexation of those territories. And this is very clear that the risk is there. And for many Abkhazians and South Ossetians, particularly the Abkhazians, this is not a favorable option. And I would argue that the European integration of Georgia would somehow change the calculations that, Abkhazian elites and Abkhazian society is making in this context. Would they see their future better protected as being annexed by Russia, or potentially have some kind of approximation and some kind of relationships with the European Union and Georgia, which is also becoming part of European Union? So that's a little bit of how I look at the conflict resolution agenda, conflict transformation agenda. And I think that, with the European Union experience, we have Cyprus, which is very interesting experience in that regard, where, conflict is not solved, but the place is peaceful, and there is a development there, and there is a peace there. And, I think even this feeling of safety and security and, future perspective is also very different in our context, where, we have constant detentions of civilians. We've had cases of killings of civilians. We have problems with the freedom of movement, detentions, etc. So all of these problems would be solved, I think, if that was more, if Georgia was developing towards, or was progressing towards a European integration process.
So if Georgia moves towards European integration, that would hopefully solve or rectify or start to work towards rebuilding Georgia's international standing. But you also talk in your article about the opportunities that Georgia has to rebuild their regional role. I wondered if you could talk to that and what practical steps Georgia would need to take to kind of put itself back in that position of being a regional powerhouse and a diplomatic hub in the region.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're right. I mean, historically, for the past 30 years, although Georgia had its own problems, but still, it served as a host for, normalization talks between the neighbors, particularly between Armenia and Azerbaijan. And obviously this was contributing to the regional stabilization to some extent. And I think that now in this regional geopolitical climate, this is becoming even more valuable role, so to speak, particularly with the renewed interest in the middle corridor, right, which is linking Europe to Central Asia via the South Caucasus. And the strategic importance of this region has been elevated. So in this regard, I think that this definitely the current dynamic is an opportunity. It should be an opportunity for Georgia to position itself as a kind of central actor in the regional cooperation, and it should be done through enhanced cooperation with Armenia, Azerbaijan, Turkey, European Union. Black Sea security context is also very important. So in other words, Georgia could contribute not only to its own positioning as a country, but also to the strategic value of the South Caucasus as a whole, right? Where you have more predictable transit routes, you have, more predictability in terms of long-term investments, etc., etc. But the thing is, for this to happen, Georgia needs to be a reliable partner. Georgia needs to be a reliable actor. And this requires a stable and predictable government in Tbilisi, first of all. And this also requires very strong and strategic relationships with the European Union and the US as well, because the whole idea of the Middle Corridor and the US interest now in the South Caucasus, it is visible. And Georgia cannot remain in this position of being hostile with the European Union, for instance, right? Yesterday we saw the statement from Kaya Kallas, who says that, they do not want to talk to Tbilisi. With this kind of relationships, obviously Georgia cannot claim that it can be a stable, reliable partner in this middle corridor, in this, trade links between Asia and Europe. So, yeah, exactly. I mean, Georgia needs internal stability. Georgia needs internal political stability, credibility, capacity, which has been damaged by the Georgian Dream government. And Georgia needs to restore its relationships, its strategic relationships with the European Union, with the US, with Turkey and neighbors, obviously.
Okay, amazing. So I just to start to wrap up then, I suppose, what do you think people should pay more attention to? And that can obviously be something that you've already said. And if you have any book recommendations or anything that you would recommend for people who wanted to learn more about what's happening in Georgia at the moment.
Yeah, I would say probably it is important to pay attention to what is happening in Georgia, and probably pay attention to particularly to those democratic groups and democratic forces that continue to fight against authoritarianism, against the consolidation of one party power in Georgia. And then there are these groups, there are civic groups, there are political groups that continue to fight and struggle. There are political prisoners in this country who pay very high price for the fight for democracy. And I would probably ask everyone to pay attention to those democratic forces in the country, because they are still here. They still continue to fight. They still believe in Georgia's democratic future. And it is really important to continue to support them one way or another, whether these are political statements, whether these are different political platforms, whether these are financial, assistance, or anything that can be, helpful in the current situation.
And lastly, Medea, any book recommendations at all?
Yeah, I want to recommend the book which I just finished reading just 2 days ago, and it's an book called Prophet's Song by Irish author Paul Lynch, and this is a relatively new book from 2023, and this is a story of a mother of 4 in Ireland. Ireland, which is turning authoritarian and where the civil war is unleashing. So the story is a story of a family as seen by a mother and is experienced by a mother who is losing her husband and even kids to this authoritarian regime. And like reading this was very triggering, I have to say, like having lived in this Georgian context in the past 3 years, and the whole idea how she's trying to save her family and save the members of the family, but at the same time how her decisions are actually harming her family as well, and the decision that she has is like not to leave the country. And then when she decides to leave, it's too late because she already lost part of her family. So then this question this was triggering a lot also because, we see a lot of out migration from authoritarian regimes, right? Be it Russia, Belarus, people are fleeing for their lives. And here in Georgia, we also have this question of, and this is very big question among the activists and among the many members of the society. What should we do? Should we stay and continue the fight, or should we leave and try to rebuild our lives in a safer environment? So I think this book is kind of I could relate to this book very
Yeah.
much, so I would recommend everyone to read it.
Okay, perfect. Well, thank you so much. It's been a
Yeah.
pleasure always to speak to you. So have a lovely rest of your day. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Grace. Thank you.